Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr Chairman, I'm happy to take a call to respond to the points that the member has raised. And I appreciate that the issue of process is one that the opposition feels very strongly about. But I want to repeat what I've said at the commencement of each of the two previous parts of this bill. This process has been transparent and robust and clear and dates from the presentation of the Tax Working Group's report in January of this year. As part of the budget process and indeed the part of the work of the Tax Working Group, all of the documentation has been released publicly. It's been out there on websites. It's in the public arena right from the beginning. The budget contained regulatory impact statements relating to the changes that are contained in the SOP. We have been absolutely clear right from the beginning about an open process. Now, as I said earlier, after the budget, an issues paper was released on the 24th of May. That, in fact, received 24 submissions, and draft legislation, which forms the basis of the SOP, was released in October. A further 10 submissions and comments were received on that. In addition, discussion took place with the New Zealand Institute of Chartered Accountants, the Law Society, and all the usual suspects about detail over that time, and I acknowledge their contribution and their input, and changes continued to be made up until the time that the SOP was signed off and released publicly on Tuesday. It has been a very considered and deliberate process because the issues contained within the SOP are significant. The member keeps talking about $2.3 billion of tax losses emanating out of the LAQC sector. That's certainly true. I remind him it actually grew by 400% during the term of his government. The explosion in LAQCs rapidly increased under the term of the previous government. The major driver was the avoidance opportunity created by that government shifting the top personal tax rate to 39 cents. And we've dealt with that not only by reducing the rate but also aligning it to the trust rate. So that escalation will not continue in the future. But even if you take the total swag of LAQCs, estimated to be somewhere in the order of 130,000, approximately half of them, in fact the figure I've seen of 49.8% to be precise, relate to property. And as I said at an earlier stage of the debate, of the $2.3 billion in tax losses, approximately $800 million are attributable to property-related losses. So when the member talks about the fact that the net's not being cast widely enough, what we are doing with these changes is a couple of things. Firstly, we are restructuring the broad qualifying company regime. We are going to move to a full look-through process. I've indicated earlier changes to be made to the dividend regime in due course. Second, we are seeking to prevent the worst of the abuses that were occurring in the property-related area and address that essential conundrum where the Tax Working Group pointed out that some $2 billion of investment in property produced losses of $500 million per annum and a revenue loss to the Crown of $150 million per annum. We are addressing that through the changes that are being made in this bill. And I come back to the point that I've made at every stage of this debate. The reason for this having to be done in the way that it has been done, given that we've given virtually a year's notice of our intention, is that these changes take effect from the 1st of April next year. A number, and I think Mr Burns or Mr Mallard may have been referred to this earlier, a number of LAQCs and the entities that are associated with them will need to change. They need time to make that transition. Inland Revenue need time to gear up for that transition. This legislation has to be passed at this point to enable that 1 April goal, which I hear from the opposition they do not disagree with, to be met. Mr Chairman, I said earlier, and I stand by it, we have been punctilious in terms of the consultation process. We have been very clear to ensure that at every stage, all of the points that have been raised have been considered right from the time of the Tax Working Group last year. And the outcome has been one where we have a piece of legislation that is credible, is workable, and will address the abuses that were being raised as part of the TWG report that everyone was knowing were occurring and were seeking action upon. Mr Chairman, I think this is good legislation and I think it will stand the test of time.
Call the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Chairman, the Minister's comments do deserve a direct reply. And let us be fair, the Minister is quite correct that the general intent of policy was made known in the budget. And he's also quite correct that an early draft form of legislation was made available to the industry. Those matters publicly are not in dispute. What is equally not in dispute, and the Minister wouldn't disagree with this either, the matters which resulted from that were not presented to a select committee, were not subject to parliamentary scrutiny, did not have access to the independent tax advice of the FEC's independent advisor. And I think the Minister is in grave danger here of setting a precedent that could undermine the generic tax policy process more generally, because he seems to be inferring, Mr Chairman, to the House that it is somehow okay, that it is somehow acceptable if a government announces a policy intent and consults that might be implying and somehow consults with the industry, that it gets some form of leave pass and can bypass a select committee. And that, of course, is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to the public, first, because the select committee is the opportunity where the public can make submissions, where the public can be heard. And it's more, frankly, something that smells, rather, of a kind of smoke-filled, closed-room dialogue between a number of parties that have deeply vested interests. And that is not acceptable in the New Zealand Constitution. It's not acceptable in good parliamentary practice. This is a change of practice for this Minister, and it's not okay for this House. And we've made that point repeatedly. But I do need to raise several issues specifically about clauses in Part 3. And again, I say, it is not easy for members of the House to cross-check the provisions in the SOP recently received with the underlying provisions of the bill to which they cross-refer. The interface between the portfolio investment entity regime, such as in new clauses 78, 79, 80 through to 82, a matter of some interest. There have been allegations that PIEs, portfolio investment entities, have been subject to similar abuse to LAQCs. Where is the analysis, Minister, which shows how consideration has been given to managing that boundary going forward, whether similar issues might occur under look-through companies, whether the removal of some of the arbitrage from LAQCs has removed the possibility of arbitrage between PIEs and LTCs or not. Those are the sorts of matters that we would expect to see in a regulatory impact statement, in an options analysis. But we don't have one, because the government that championed the Regulatory Responsibility Bill has followed its own procedures in less than 50% of legislation put through this House. And perhaps that's not surprising, because it set a 5-year record this week for the highest proportion of legislation going through under urgency of at least the last 5 years. I haven't been able to go back and check earlier than that. So we've got rushed legislation violating the government's own regulatory. Crusher has become a tax policy expert. That worries me deeply. Worries me as deeply as the process, Mr. Speaker. Because without good scrutiny, as my colleague Brennan Burns said before, pass this in haste. Revise it at leisure. And the Minister's made the point that he's got dividend amendments coming through. There will be tax bills, at least 2 next year. What would have been wrong with putting these matters to the Select Committee in a way that the Select Committee could subject to the proper process? And the Minister of Police and Corrections may not care about the tax loss, but the tax loss that's being addressed through this bill is larger than the vote of the police. Larger than the vote of the police. That might explain why she's only put 30 new cops on the beat rather than the 1,000 that she promised. So there's a big gap between that minister's rhetoric and her reality. And there's a big gap between the government's rhetoric about regulatory responsibility and the actual practice, where less than half the bills it's passed this year have been through a proper process. And that's something that should shock New Zealanders. Should shock New Zealanders. Mr. Chairman, the return requirements for multi-rate PIEs appear in Clause 80C, and they are deemed to occur at a 31 May date, 31 May, the year after the end of the tax year. And, sir, we're worried about arbitrage opportunities between.
I call Stuart Nash.